So thanks everybody for joining Fraction's latest webinar in our series of 5 big things in the pharmaceutical industry right now. I think this is maybe the 6th webinar, so we may be gone past 5 of big things, but nevertheless, it's very important, the next subject we now tackle today. First thing I should say is that we are recording the webinar, so if there's any issues around that, I'd kindly ask you to dial off now, but otherwise very good to have you on board and to agree to the marketing piece with Fraction. So just to let you know that today's webinar is entitled Lost in Translations, a quick guide to multilingual eCOA, and will be presented by Helen Williams and Katri Langell. Speaking to Helen and Katri earlier today, I can assure you a very entertaining session looking at COA. And for me, it's really an eye-opener, really how this has really exploded in the last few years, with sort of globalization of clinical trials, you know, the E component around those as well. And really sort of how we tackle that and the importance of really an early preparation. So I shouldn't steal Helen and Katri's thunder, and maybe I'll pass over to Helen and Katri straight away. So over to you, Helen and Katri, to introduce.
Thank you, Nigel. I'm Helen Williams. I have worked in life sciences for about the past 14 years. My background academically is linguistic. I have a doctorate in Italian literature, which doesn't necessarily apply to this topic, but it does give me some linguistic sense of how to run projects. And I have worked in different environments, from CRO to consultancy, and at the moment, I have my own language agency called the Word Desk, and I'm a Fraction partner advising on all these matters, the eCOA translations and linguistic validation. I have worked with Katri for a number of years. I'll hand over to her for a quick intro as well. Katri.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Katri Langell, and I have been working in clinical trials industry for last 20 years, mainly with eCOAs. And on the technology platform, technology vendor side. And I started my career when I joined CRF Box, which later became CRF Health and is now Signant Health through acquisition. And I have been working in project management, process development, helping startup companies in this technology side meet the regulatory standards and different kind of functionalities that are needed in clinical trials, and also working with business development, working on bring your own device validation work and that kind of stuff. And yes, met Helen when I was working with White Access, and it's been a pleasure to work with Helen, and really looking forward to this session today. So lovely to meet.
Yeah, thanks everybody for attending. Just a quick note, if you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we're going to leave some time for Q&A at the end as well, so there should be plenty of time to have some discussions. Can my screen be seen, Nigel, Katri, etc.?
Okay.
Great. So I'm going to start off and then pass the baton to Katri. I'm going to talk about some quick start tips to multilingual eCOA, looking at it from my perspective as a linguistic validation guide, and Katri's from the more technical vendor side of things. Hold on, where am I? So what is multilingual eCOA? Let me know if you know all of this in the chat. Let me know if you've got no idea about this field. It might help me for the question time as well. But multilingual eCOA is a process of translating electronic clinical outcome assessments. If you're not sure what they are, it's essentially an umbrella term for 4 different types of data gathering instruments. So you have patient-reported outcomes, clinician-reported outcomes, observer-reported outcomes, and also performance observed measures. So that might be things like mobility or walk tests or cognitive tests that are given to patients to fill out. These are critical tools in clinical research for gathering health-related quality of life data, information on health status and treatment data, and across the world, so across diverse populations. was known as COA originally when it was traditionally paper clinical outcome assessments. And obviously in recent years, we've had much more of an electronic context. So the work that we do quite often takes traditional paper instruments and migrates them into the new electronic context, or you have an electronic COA that is it's designed specifically for the electronic context from the start. Most of them are developed in English-speaking countries, though that can vary. So Canada, the US, South Africa, UK. So you have some adaptation work even between English language versions. So English for the US gets adapted for the UK. And also, obviously, for target languages like Thai, French, Spanish, global languages, you have a more robust process even still. So linguistic validation covers those two scenarios: same language, different country, and brand new language, brand new country. So what is linguistic validation? There are lots of terms out there for, translation across industries. You'll hear things like localization, translation, transcreation, cultural adaptation. There's lots of different types. Linguistic validation is specific to this industry, and it's for clinical outcomes assessments. And I'll show you a sort of flow of what the sort of steps that are involved. But what it's designed for is to facilitate data comparison across different language groups, the same instrument. It's required in studies to meet regulatory requirements, so FDA, EMA, for example. It also addresses how sensitive and culturally appropriate an instrument is, so that participants in a study, whether it be traditional site-based or decentralized or real world, help them feel included and engaged. I've given some examples there, but you're looking at things like register and tone. So is it for adolescents? Is it for adults? Is it for caregivers? Is it, do you have to take the therapeutic area considerations into account as well? So are you looking at perhaps people have visual impairments, or they have impairments when they're touching a screen with their dexterity? So you're looking at all sorts of different things when you're adapting eCOA for different cultures and different populations. Also, key thing is it's a lay focus. So we don't want healthcare professional jargon in there. This process is designed to make an instrument appropriate for the widest possible lay audience. And that can be really interesting across the globe as well. I've done studies before where very low literacy rates, for example, in certain parts of Latin America, when I was working on this particular project, meant we had to strip a questionnaire right back to the bare bones just for basic comprehension. And then, of course, you get other locations where people can understand the content very easily. And then you're making more minor updates, like GP to physician or A&E to emergency room, things like that. But what I'll tell you about next is something really key to linguistic validation, and it's concept equivalence. And this is why the whole process is designed this way. A couple of examples I've put in here. It's not A to B translation. So for example, on the left-hand side there, this was in a pediatric word acquisition list. It was a list of all kinds of things: TV shows, sports, places of worship, places you go every day. And it was designed to see what kind of words 5-year-olds, for example, knew. In the US English, they talked about sneakers, for example, but to go into India, a particular part of India, that wouldn't have made sense. So the concept equivalent there was an anklet. So the children there would understand the word anklet, but not the translated equivalent of sneaker. The next example, in a US English questionnaire, can you cut a steak with a knife and fork? The concept it's getting at there for the data acquisition purposes is, can this individual use a precision movement with a bit of strength in their fingers? Can they hold cutlery? Can they cut their steak? That didn't work for India. And the concept equivalent was breaking a chapati with their fingertips. Similar, getting at the similar thing, but just directly translating steak with knife and fork wouldn't have worked. People wouldn't be able to relate to that in their everyday life. And then you can see the last example is a bit simpler. It's, can you walk a block in the US? Translate that to half a mile in the UK. People might understand walking a block in the UK. They might do that if they live in the city. But to reach them, more respondents, you're looking for a solution that most people are going to be able to relate to. So concept equivalence is the absolute key thing you're looking for in linguistic validation. And the not so fun side of this when you're working on client projects is quite often you deliver a final translation, and well, not quite often, I've had occasions, a client will say, what have you done? It doesn't mean the same as the original. And you say, well, no, it doesn't, deliberately, because it's been through the process. And that's the concept you need in order to get the right kind of comprehension from the patients and a genuine natural answer that they understand and makes sense related to their health. Does that make sense for everybody? Please do throw any questions in as we go. Just to give you an overview of that process. So as I said, it's not an A to B process. Valtraud on the call and Tomislav will know this very well. And I've tried to simplify this. Actually, there are some diagrams which are much more complicated, but essentially you write a concept elaboration, which goes into that concept equivalence, and it gives a roadmap for translators of what to avoid and what to aim for. And this is for global translations. You then go into adapting and forward translating. Step 3, you're reconciling 2 different forward translations to get a best of both versions from 2 linguists. And then it goes to back translation, which seems maybe like overkill, but it's essentially a window into the translation and where it's going. And it allows the project team to see where the Zulu translating is going, or the Thai translation, or the, you know, Philippines English, or Canada French translation is actually going. So it allows you to compare the current draft translation to the source and say, hold on, you've got this concept of depressed, but it's coming out as the blues in French. Is that the same thing? Does that actually mean the same thing? And you work on that and you refine it. Step 5 is the sort of most complex and often most interesting step, and that's with you're working with actual respondents in the target country and the target language, going through item by item through the language, seeing that they understand it, and whether the concepts have gone awry, whether you need to change anything. And QA, I've simplified that right down, but that can be multiple proofreading steps, quality checks, and final eyes. And this process, obviously that's quite complex, becomes even more complex when it's an electronic eCOA project, because then you've also got to get this into the software, checked in the software, which is what Katri will tell you a bit more about. Some of the challenges, I won't go through all of these because we have limited time, but you can see what we're up against. So you're looking at a paper questionnaire would be telling you to tick the box. On screen, you're going to have to choose your option, select your option, tap the screen, whatever the instruction is. You might be looking at date and time formats that need different treatment across countries. Branching logic is when you have a sentence like, I've actually got something in front of me. You know, during the past week, did you experience bleeding? Did you experience sadness? Did you experience oozing? And that works in English, but it doesn't work in every language, because you might need grammar agreements, or you might need the whole sentence in order for it to make sense in context. So that's really quite a challenge, especially when you're on a limited screen size. Language expansion is, say, German expands quite a lot from English, so you naturally have longer words, longer sentences to fit into your eCOA screen. Left to right, right to left languages, and all these other things I've listed. So some languages aren't supported in some software. You've also got to look at keeping terminology consistent throughout the content. That's not so hard with translation technology as it is these days, but it does prove a challenge when you're checking in situ on devices. So you can imagine, you know, I have a questionnaire here, and you can see that the past week is used in every question. It says the past week, and on one glance I can tell. But on a screen, I'd have to look at 20, 30 screens to make sure that that terminology is the same all the way through. So it's just an extra bit of project management headache, really. And linguistic validation legacy content is a huge piece. That means clinical outcome assessments that are existing already. So first of all, you have source instruments, and they might be various versions. That you could have 6 versions of the source instrument. They could vary just because they've been updated in various grammatical ways, or they could be different versions for therapeutic area, recall period, or audience. So you have to look at what exists in the source. And then that also trickles through to existing translated versions. So you have to really look at the content available for a study. You know, something like EQ5D will exist now in most languages. So you can be quite confident you can pull it into your study fairly easily with hopefully not that much adaptation. There are other instruments where it's much more complicated, and there's a lot of work to do in assessing exactly what needs doing from a language point of view in terms of updates. And just to illustrate here, if this process isn't followed adequately, they are the risk areas on the left there, looking at real problems, even legal risks or poor quality data, non-compliance. Also, critically, patient disengagement. If something doesn't resonate with them or isn't written properly, they could well drop out of the study or just not fill out the questionnaire, just get to the end and, you know, put the phone down. Rigorous translation, on the other hand, will, you know, achieve a clear understanding, and their responses will have meaning, and you should be compliant, and your data set should be much more robust. And hopefully that second to last point, your study will be able to be deployed much more effectively and much more quickly. I'll hand to Katri now, and Katri will tell you more from the, so that's me as leading a language team on that side of things, and we would work together hand in hand on this kind of project. So Katri will tell you about her side of the coin.
Yes, okay. So looking at the tech vendor, eco vendor considerations. So first, of course, you may, if you want to use your existing vendor, then maybe you don't need to consider all of this, but let's say that you are looking for a new vendor. So first thing, of course, to check is, well, one of the first thing is the eco vendor experience in delivering multinational studies. How many languages they have translated, and who are their suppliers and partners? Who do they work with? For example, translator partners. And another thing is to check that do they follow internationalization best practices? This comes to the platform, so can they handle translations? If they cannot handle them really well, it will end up in situation where there are missing characters, line breaks, alignment problem in right to left languages, for example. And do they support different kind of date and time formats, so on. Also good to check, can they handle large scale of translation and languages? If we are thinking, for example, a big international phase 3 study. And can they accurately predict this, provide timelines from their end? Then are you going to use provisioned devices, bring your own device approach, or maybe both, or web application? And can this vendor work on this? What are the technical capabilities from language perspective, but other perspective as well? How flexible the platform is, what kind of content they can create. And very important is to discuss with them what is their experience provided implementing VAS and NRS scales. So there are some eco vendors who have not been able actually to implement those based on the best practices and guidelines. Another considerations that you may want to think about is e-consent. Are you going to use e-consent, and does it come from the same provider? And is the implementation appropriate? And do they have existing libraries? But I like to point out that sometimes, even if that could be possible, they may want to start translations, for example, from the scratch, because something may have changed. And also in these processes, there are so many different formats, templates, and maybe the platform is not so capable that maybe they don't have all the processes in place, so they may prefer actually to start from all the way from the beginning. because it may make their life easier, but this is something that should be discussed with them, and also what kind of translation management system they have in place, what kind of workflows, and do they have, for example, automated QC. In many of these processes, it includes lots of human work, verification work, and this, of course, produce more errors. So if there is more automation in these processes, is better. What kind of another thing to consider is what kind of visuals, images could be needed, and can they produce those, and what kind of text reminders there will be in the application that patients will be using. And it's always good to select an onboard vendor as soon as possible and optimize processes and templates to avoid any miscommunication and delays in the process. We can go to the next slide. So some of the pitfalls in the process. So developing and migrating eCOA, it often requires lots of changes before those are approved. So I mentioned version control before. So there have been cases when, for example, application specialists, someone in the development team, have been working with the previous version, not the final version. So always make sure that the final version is used, and that the ecosystem should be fit for purpose. So, for example, there have been cases that actually even vendor may have said that they can do this and that, they actually cannot do that. So it's good to make clear at the beginning that their platform and system really can produce what they say that it can. And when we are dealing with implementing these eCOAs, there have been often, so there are guidelines that you should follow, the team should follow, and the results should be as equivalent as possible with those. But there often can be a different kind of text and formatting, or colors or font not being within prescribed guidelines, and it creates delays, and it's a back and forth discussion with, for example, the license holder and the team. So that's why it's also good to create awareness and educate the team as early as possible, so that everyone understands that why they need to do these things in a certain way, because otherwise it's just gonna cause additional delays, and those are not going to be accepted. So it doesn't make any sense to create implementations that do not follow the guidelines. Communication and processes between stakeholders are always very important. Translation certificates may help streamline ethic approval, so you don't need to always provide screenshots for every language version. Translation certificates can be enough. And then from the technical point of view, it's good that there is a mapping of text IDs and translations in place in the platform. If not, it may produce lots of errors and lots of review processes, and you may come up have a surprise in UAT that there is a totally different kind of translation in place. So make sure that they have that in the platform. It makes life a lot more easier. And as Helen mentioned, for example, German, it's such a long language, so how it can be fit on the screen. And there are these other language considerations, how they can handle those different characters and so on. And also good to check at the very early on, already when discussing with vendors, that what kind of translations they do have in place for their own software. reminders and notifications and so on. So maybe they have those for 5 languages, but not for 20. So those need to be translated then as well. And this will have, of course, impact on timelines. And it's always too good do as much of testing as possible before UAT to avoid any surprises and additional delays. You really don't want to have a huge surprise at UAT because it often happened very late in the phase before first phase and first visit. So that's also something to consider. Then regarding the project management, so when you have a vendor and translation vendor selected, translation vendor actually could also come from eCOA vendor side, but they should have kickoff meeting, and this is separate from the study kickoff. And in these meetings, they need to understand all the language and country requirements and country priority list as well, which countries will go live first and are more important than maybe the following countries, and what are the roles and responsibilities between project managers, license specialists, translation specialists. Very important to have communication plan. And once the translation process has been finalized, there are final import of translations, reviews and approvals, and then submission. So either if needed screenshots or maybe just the certifications, and sometimes can be enough. This is very high level process here, but all these steps in all these phases includes lots of steps. And as I mentioned, it's often lots of back and forth between different team members, feedback from the license holder, for example, and back to the implementation team, and communication is really a key, and processes that those are followed and everyone is clear that what is needed and when and what steps need to be taken. And then at the end is a overview of the translations of processes, and this actually can be found in WCG website to help with this. And another good resource to check is Critical Path Institute. They have lots of different kind of materials available regarding eCOA implementation and processes. So if you are not familiar with them yet, I highly recommend to check them out as well. Back to you, Helen.
Thank you, Katri. So I can see some questions have come through. We put together this checklist with 10 of our agreed points on what to sort of bear in mind, points to consider if you're getting into an eCOA project. So really, you know, selecting an experienced partner will make a difference. Planning as early as possible between the teams, because, you know, historically it hasn't always been the case that workflows would be, you know, shared between eCOA vendor and translation company or group. I've had experiences of both sides where it's been a bit more separate and where it's been very much working together day to day with product and translations, and it makes a big difference if you're just communicating early on and you've got, you know, some input even into the source or the legacy translation sort of plan. It's key, really. Number 3, deep diving into research basically on all of the components. So as I was saying to Nigel and Katri earlier, it used to be that I'd lay everything out on a table with a highlighter, but you're looking at quite minute details in instruments and between versioning and between country language versions. And if you pick that stuff up early, you're going to save yourself huge headaches later on. It can help you give recommendations as to which legacy translations you want. You know, there'll be multiple Spanish versions and multiple French versions, for example, for different countries. and you really need a language expert to get in and say, well, actually on this occasion you should go for the French Canada version and sort of adapt that rather than the French France version, because it's, there are different iterations of it. Looking at licensing is a huge headache. Different contracting arrangements between the vendors and the sponsor, and different conditions for use, and cost can skyrocket depending on the different instruments that are selected, and the amount of work for translations, really, if it's from scratch or even updates, it can just vary wildly. So getting heads into the details early on is really a good idea. And then agreeing, like I say, the rest of them, it's really about best practices and talking to each other and getting agreements and sharing your workflow, sharing your checklists, and anticipating that there will be some mistakes and there will be some iterations, and letting the client, the sponsor, know that. It's rare that an eCOA program would go without iterations. I mean, it's pretty much part of the course. So build it in, keep trails of everything. And build in time for expert reviews, because I have got an example I always wheel out. But there was one study that I was on where the sponsor needed developer approvals on about 30 to 40 different versions. And the developer had gone on a polar bear expedition for months. And I had to keep giving project updates. So I can't get sign off. They're not there. They're not coming back yet. And there are these strange, very human obstacles in the process that you just can't believe sometimes. And it's tricky. You've got to build in extra time for reviews and for approvals. What else I can say? There's some questions which we could deal with. Katri, I don't know if you can see the chat, but also if I answer a couple of these, and then the floor could be open and we take any additional questions. So I can take the one from Paul. Are there any countries that present greater challenges than others? Yes, definitely. And it's for a number of different reasons. Katri mentioned, that the sponsor or client will have batches of languages that they need to roll out in certain order for their own study priorities. So there's that to consider. But another really good thing to do between all the parties is to figure out this batching of languages, because some languages are incredibly easy to finalize and get going. English adaptations are the quickest. And, something naturally harder to recruit linguists in, harder because of the time in the sort of punctuality of linguists in that language, honestly, is a cultural thing often. I had a 100 language project once, and I'm not saying anything wrong about African languages, but they were challenging, and the African languages needed an extra month and a half to finalize, just because of the complexity, the difficulty of understanding the content of the review grids, but also sourcing the translators and having backups, and just the practicalities of running a translation project in more difficult languages. There's a funny example is in Navajo culture. We once did a feasibility study and didn't actually translate into Navajo, but they have a cyclical concept of time. So they don't believe in deadlines. So you just can't set a deadline for the work coming in. So you get used to over time, I can send things to Valtrad and she will be my most punctual delivery, won't you, Valtrad? And then there'll be much, we categorize languages, say, well, in my experience, it's been like a 0 to 4 categorization of complexity, cost, and resourcing. Some surprising things like Swiss languages are expensive and difficult to find translators in. Just not as big a population, there's not as many professional translators, maybe. Things like that. So definitely there are challenges. And also from a cultural perspective, what comes to mind is, say, taboo subjects. Once there was a suicidality instrument that I worked on, and the cognitive debriefing wasn't happening because respondents in their culture in Japan, they don't talk about the topic of suicide, and they wouldn't participate in the interviews. And it wasn't that they don't get asked to talk about personal experience, they just get asked to talk about the language, but even so they didn't feel comfortable, so it couldn't happen. So things like that to be really, you know, sometimes you don't know till you're in the project. You can't foresee some of these problems, but it's an interesting one for sure. And what else do we have? Paul asked, I assume many CROs state they can do this standard work, but how often is that proven wrong where they need assistance? I guess both of us could answer this. Katri, shall I have a quick go?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you go first.
My answer would be yes, CROs will say they do this. It varies because actually, I would say if the thought leaders in linguistic validation and eCOA, there are excellent thought leaders in the industry. As Katri mentioned, the CPATH consortium would have some of the really big names. We've got Scotty Kern, we've got Willie Mulhausen, Bill Byram. I'm sure there are lots more. Diane Wilde trained me. She wrote the ISPOR task force guidelines. There's some big names, Paul O'Donoghue, tons. And there will be teams in CROs who've had very close contact with them, who've worked with them, they've even been part of companies with them, or there have been acquisitions of expert teams into CROs, in which case they will know what they're doing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there might be people saying we can handle this, and then perhaps they're having a struggle to actually deliver it 100%. Because they might not have access to some of that senior methodology advice and experience. That would be my initial take on that. Katri?
Yeah, so CROs, they can provide eCOA and translations, but either in-house or they outsource those from other providers. So yeah, and then if they have those in-house, then you just need to check what kind of system they have in place, what they can deliver, what time, in what cost, and so on. So it could sound like an ideal situation that you get everything from one place, but then you may end up in some kind of issue. So I mean, not saying that it will happen, but yeah, you just need to know and be aware, and yeah, good to look around with what different vendors actually do have. And then countries, what comes to eCOA and e-consent. So for example, in Europe, there are different regulatory requirements that how those can be handled in different countries. So those as well should be considered, or how you can use, for example, telemedicine and that stuff. So a lot trickier in Europe, for example, than in the US.
I think Tom had a question as well, Helen.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I'm just mulling it over. I can't say I have very good statistics or anything on that. I think linguistic validation comes quite late in the design process. So I haven't seen, but it could just be that I don't have enough visibility of what's going on after I've delivered. What I'm thinking is, yes, we resolve quite a lot of issues in the test process. And perhaps with something like a real world study where you have more, the flexibility to change who you're targeting as the study grows and develops, because you've got your own platform and you can kind of target through social media or recruitment. Perhaps there's a bit more flexibility there. And if you see that the global uptake on the different questionnaires is kind of dropping, then you can address that and sort of change your strategy. But I don't know that I have a very solid example to give you about the clinical trial, the site-based kind of example. Katri, have you seen recruitment strategy change due to that kind of a thing?
No, not with that, but I would like to emphasize, I don't remember if I said that when I was talking, but I think patients should be involved in different processes as soon as possible to get their feedback already when you are designing the protocol and thinking what kind of PROs you are going to use to get their feedback. And then also as early as possible, once you have selected your eco vendor, to run the design idea through them, what kind of feedback you can get from them, so that you don't end up in situation when the study is once launched, and then the patients find that actually I don't like this, and this is too much burden for me, or I will get a headache when I need to look this mobile phone like 6 times a day. So all kind of considerations that you may not think beforehand. So that's why it's good to get also feedback from patients as many times as possible before creating the final solution and going live.
Yeah, with real world studies, I've certainly been involved in early focus groups with patients where we've gone through the data acquisition strategy and the questionnaires and got their feedback before it's even translated, which has been incredibly useful, really, really good. And you get a chance to see that burden, all the different cultural take. With one rare disease, it was just even simple things like in country, what kind of a physician or medical professional they even saw, we weren't sure about till we spoke to them. And also things like leg braces and, you know, the constraints they have on a daily basis that we weren't aware of until we spoke to them. So, yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that question, Tom. I'll go away and think about that some more.
So I think that was the chat questions, guys. Is there any other questions on the line?
Just a curious one. I've done validation and back translation for brand names. I know that comes back very often with all sorts of crazy stuff that means if you've got an instrument and you're looking for, we saw the issue of blocks and miles or sneakers and whatever. Do you have panels of patients? How do you get that insight that then finds that it is cutting a steak or breaking a, you know?
That's the first of all, you have the linguist. So if for example, Valtraud, again, I'll bring you into it. Valtraud will tell me what she knows about the German context for that particular questionnaire, whether it's units of measurement or cultural references, places of worship, things like that. We'll also then take it to cognitive debriefing. So I've just been doing some today, looking at a questionnaire about carcinoma with 5 patients in the UK. And I took them, Valtraud will do this regularly as well in German for questionnaires. And you go through item by item and get them to rephrase every item, everything from tick the box to, you know, this symptoms. So angry or sad or depressed, you say to them, put it in your own words, imagine you're explaining it to a child, what's coming to mind, and you get through this cognitive information so you can tell. And you have a diverse population as well for those interviews, so a mix of gender, age, occupation, and educational levels. So the idea is you're trying to check it's going to be a fair representation of the population at large and that people are going to understand it. So yeah, we test, and it's a really fascinating process because you will find that people. I had a questionnaire last month. It was talking about sexual functioning, and all 5 women said, I find that really robotic. What does that even mean? And then you dig deeper and you find out what alternative they might prefer or why it's problematic for them. So yeah, it's a really key step in the process.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it is very, very human feedback that you get. And, you know, obviously you get an insight into patients' daily lives and how they cope with various conditions, and it's quite moving at times. Definitely it helps you realize that, you know, these might just be seen as instruments that just need to be in French or just need to be in Spanish, but actually real people are on the receiving end and they need to feel comfortable, and they're going to give you their best shot at answering if they do feel comfortable with it and if it makes sense to them.
Okay. Any last questions? Okay, going on. So, Helen, Katri, thank you sincerely for, again, a fascinating discussion. I think, again, really highlights the huge level of expertise we have amongst the partner group at Fraction. Again, an area of the business that is clearly growing in scale and importance. I think, you know, whether it be regulator or payers will need more information directly from patient-reported outcomes and how that's managed. I think that's going to grow in importance. So again, I know where I'm going to come to when I come next against eCOA. Helen and Katri, no doubt, and amongst colleagues. And I know I'll get the very best advice. And I think, again, that's good communication. I think that, what we need to do is, I think you said it, to think about these things early on in the life cycle of clinical studies and really get experts in that know what they're talking about and can help people on their journey, which Helen and Katri, you've perfectly described today. So that's certainly what I'll be doing, and I'm sure many others across the industry should be doing the same. So thank you again, Helen and Katri, and thank you everybody for joining today's webinar.